Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Angelo Florimon, and today I'm going to be talking about my case, which is titled Rosenfeld versus Basquiat. Before I start my presentation, I came across an interesting fact that states that there are approximately 100 million lawsuit cases that are filed in the United States every year. And out of those 100 million lawsuit cases, 25,000 involve a deceased person. And in my research, I'm going to be talking about one of those cases, which is titled Rosenfeld and Basquiat. Miss Michelle Rosenfeld was an art collector suing Mr. Jean Michel Basquiat for failing to complete an agreement. And that agreement was to sell Miss Rosenfeld 3 paintings. And when they were signing the contract, Mr. Basquiat decided to create a contract with a piece of paper and a crayon stating this contract is going to be worth millions and millions of dollars in the future. Unfortunately, Mr. Basquiat ended up passing away, and Ms. Rosenfeld decided to sue Mr. Basquiat and his estate 6 years later. In the first trial, Ms. Rosenfeld brought a witness to the stand, which is Mr. Ron Belfort, who stated that he was part of the meeting between the two. And furthermore, she also had a forensic examiner examine the handwriting of the contract, and he sided with the plaintiff, which is Ms. Rosenfeld, stating that the handwriting was indeed the handwriting of Mr. Basquiat. While Ms. Rosenfeld did have a copy of the painting, she was unable to provide a timeline with the dependent, a timeline. With that, the defendant decided to focus on cross-contamination, and they wanted to prove that the contract was fraud. And that resulted in the jury not being able to reach a verdict, and the case was declared a mistrial, and the case was reassigned to Judge Bear for a new trial. And before the second trial started, the jury asked both the defendant and the plaintiff to go over the dead man rule, which might come into effect in this trial. And what the dead man rule is it states that a party with an interest in the litigation may not testify against a dead party about communication with a dead person. And what that is saying is somebody cannot testify against somebody that passed away stating we had this type of communication or we had a transaction. That lawsuit is going to be transferred to the estate of that defendant or the family member of that defendant. And this statute is created under state laws that's making it different amongst other states. So in Florida, we do have a dead man rule, but that dead man rule differs with the one that New York may have. And those differentiation may come from the different exemptions that may come with those dead man rules. The second trial. So when the plaintiff stated that she planned on testifying at the second trial regarding her personal communication and transaction with the defendant, it was ruled a dead man's rule, and that was applied because, like I previously stated in the previous slide, the dead man rule state you cannot talk about your personal communication and transaction with the deceased person. To continue, they made Ms. Rosenfeld an unavailable witness under the federal rule of evidence, in addition to warranting a jury instruction. And the evidence from the second trial was the same as the first trial, and the only exemption was that the estate was utilizing its own handwriting specialist, its own forensic examiner, and they were also utilizing the gallery manager who oversaw the inventory of Mr. Basquiat. And that gallery manager ended up testifying that she did went to Ms. Basquiat loft in October of 1982 and picked out 3 paintings, and she later returned to the loft but did not pick up those paintings. And the jury eventually reached a verdict in favor of Ms. Rosenfeld after the post-trial motion. The district stated that the contract that was signed did not violate any statutes of fraud or cross-contamination, and there was enough proof of damages to support their decision. Ms. Rosenfeld was rewarded with $384,000, and that represented the value of the artwork. And there was also an interested amount of $217,301.92 that was to be rewarded to the plaintiff. The defendant, which is Mr. Basquiat estate, argued that there was an error in the trial because utilizing Mr. Rosenfeld's testimony and the evidence, that both parties contractually violated the statute of fraud. And with that, the jury was reversed and the defendant remanded for a new trial. Now, according to the Federal Rule Evidence 601, every person is incompetent to be a witness except as otherwise provided in the rules. Even though the Federal Rule of Evidence eliminate most common rules regarding witness competency, they gave those powers to the states to figure out how those rules were going to be utilized. So the federal state gave the state courts the freedom to choose how they want to utilize the dead man rules and the fraud rules. And New York City, the dead man rules differ. It states that a person should be examined as a witness in his own a person should be examined as a witness in his own behalf against a deceased person regarding their communication and or transaction. And the rule NYCPLR 4519 has also been criticized by a small amount of common laws that prohibits a person to testify. Even though the states are trying to put an end to the dead man's rule, there has been no change. And to this day, we still have the dead man's rule in effect. The statute removed the testimony of the witness to anything he or she had learned from the deceased. And that caused the plaintiff, which is Ms. Rosenfeld, to argue the introduction of the testimony was not in error because of Rule 804 hearsay exceptions, waiver, and the harmless error. Rule 804 allows certain testimony from being used at a trial when they would normally be denied in other circumstances. But unfortunately, this rule does not bypass the statute and the Rosenfeld testimony. The hearsay rule itself, Rule 802, is the rule of exclusion that makes an out-of-court statement generally inadmissible when the statement is offered to prove truth in its content. On the other hand, not all of the district courts agree with that statement, comparing the American Assurance Incorporated versus Sunshine Supermarket Incorporated and the Torsen versus Miso, where these objections were explored during the hearing in the motion, and that allowed the trial to get permission for the introduction of evidence, which is different from what is happening in the Rosenfeld versus Basquiat case. The next argument that the plaintiff made was that she stated that any error that were admitted in the testimony regarding the meeting between her and the deceased defendant constitute at most harmless error. And the plaintiff came to that reasoning because she believed that without her testimony, there would be a lot more proof to sustain the jury's verdict. An error application CPLR 4519 is harmless, although of the evidentiary ruling warrant rehearsal comes into effect if it affects rights of both parties. But unfortunately, both rights of the parties were not affected, so that rule did not come, that argument did not come into effect in that case. The last argument she made was based on fraud. The state of it is entitled to judgment as a matter of law because the state of fraud makes the alleged agreement between the plaintiff and the artist enforceable. Unfortunately, the jury found out that the agreement was an oral agreement regarding the delivery date, which makes the bearing signature insufficient. To continue, the oral agreement delivery date was invalid because it could not be performed within a year. And as we know, she decided to file a lawsuit 6 years after the defendant had passed away for her to file a lawsuit. And the writing that Basquiat made in crayon for the contract also satisfied the requirement. And with that, the jury found that the Rosenfeld and Basquiat settled on one particular time for delivery, and that was not a crime and no crime was found. In conclusion, with all those facts included in this case, it was decided that the judgment has to be reversed and the case has to be remanded for a new trial. And from my opinion, I believe that there were a lot of mistakes that could have been avoided. One of these mistakes is having the proper paperwork, because not having the proper paperwork, just getting a piece of paper and a crayon to write down your contract could easily be misinterpreted and misused because there is no rules and regulations of what needs to be done. A contract saying contract and deposit wouldn't be necessarily be a contract because anybody could easily write on a piece of paper and say that they wrote that. There were no signatures, there were no proof that that person created that contract. Next is, rather than having an oral agreement, like I previously stated, it's better to have a written agreement because having an oral agreement, we're going based on he said, she said. There is no proof that this person agreed because it's an oral agreement. There is no proof in regards to what is going on and what are the rules and regulations of the agreement was. And lastly, I believe that the lawsuit should have been placed a lot sooner because waiting 6 years after the death of the defendant caused a lot more problems in regarding to find the right details of the case. And with that said, this has been my presentation on my case. I wish you guys have a great rest of the semester. Thank you very much.